A new interactive exhibition opens in Belfast this weekend. It's marking the 100th anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic.
The new £97 million Titanic Belfast experience recreates the world of 1912 and life on the doomed liner. John Stapleton went along to explore.
History's greatest sea wreck, Titanic. On its maiden voyage to New York in April 1912, the liner hit an iceberg and sank. With insufficient lifeboats, 1,500 drowned. Now, 100 years after her sinking, Belfast, the city where she was built, is reclaiming her. I've come to the magnificent new Titanic Belfast experience, a building shaped to remind us of Titanic's huge hull. Here you are transported back to 1912, to the streets of Edwardian Belfast and the decks of the Titanic. This grand staircase was the Titanic's crowning glory. The ship also had its own Turkish baths, its own telephone system and electronic lifts, luxuries unheard of at the time. Here we see the massive scale of the vessel and the tough working conditions at Harland and Wolff, where 14,000 men laboured to build and launch her on this very site in 1911. There's pride now in Titanic, a pride not lost on the relatives of the Guarantee Group, 9 Belfast men who sailed on the ship to make last-minute adjustments and went down with her.
Belfast went into mourning, understandably, but went into shame, and I think we've carried the shame for a long time. But then this city carried a lot of shame over the years, not just Titanic shame.
100 years ago, this place would have been absolutely buzzing with people. There's a famous photograph of the workforce. It's like a Lowry painting. It's just all these little matchstick men, thousands of them. It was a jewel in the British Empire's crown.
If the Titanic is not protected, it'll get stripped until all the jewels have been taken off the old lady's body.
Bob Ballard found Titanic in 1985 and told me he only agreed to be involved with Belfast's new exhibition because they will never display anything taken from the wreck site, a site he's now desperate to stop being picked clean.
It's like, going to the Louvre, you don't go up to the Mona Lisa and tap it with your finger. Go there, see it, respect it, but don't love it to death.
With a new ITV drama and a return to cinemas for James Cameron's epic, now in 3D, new technology retells this incredible story for a new generation. At the city where it all began, the skyline is dominated once again by Titanic.
Wow, that looks fascinating,
I wish
doesn't
them well
it?
with that exhibition, yeah.
Yeah.
This coming weekend marks the 100th anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic, but the wreck was only discovered 27 years ago.
The man who found it, Dr. Bob Ballard, has told John Stapleton that the site should be protected from treasure hunters who are doing irreversible damage.
What did you see? Thank you. Iceberg, right ahead.
100 years later, a global market for all things Titanic leaves the ship itself exposed.
The Titanic is really a deep-sea museum with the doors wide open. The Titanic is being loved to death. There's been a lot of damage done to the Titanic. So they go down and they land on the deck and they're tourist dives. They're selling tour dives. And the salvagers. No, they're not scientists. They're mostly people going down to salvage. I just don't want them to land. It's like, going to the Louvre, you don't go up to the Mona Lisa and tap it with your finger. The Titanic is becoming a junkyard. You see big piles of chain and big bags and, there's a lot of trash down there.
And the crow's nest, I gather, that
knocked off, yeah. Up here, we're now going up, traversing the mast, and when we found it, it had a crow's nest.
But given that so few people will actually go down there and see it, does it really matter?
Stop right there. Stop right there. Why is it that we can protect warships, which I agree, and I served in the United States Navy for 30 years, but we can't protect iconic ships like the Titanic?
Talk me through the eureka moment when you finally realised you'd seen the boiler of the Titanic.
2 in the morning. Knock on the door. 2. Hello? The cook sticks his head in the door. The cook's never up in the 6th deck. what's going on? The guys think you might want to, and I blasted right past him. He didn't even finish his sentence. And I scrambled down 6 decks in the middle of it. I thought I almost killed myself. As I walked in, our vehicle went over the boiler. And we had a picture of that boiler right on the bulkhead. And everyone looked at the video, looked up at the picture, looked back, and we realized that this wreckage we were looking at was absolutely the wreckage of the Titanic.
You are known throughout the world now as the man who found the Titanic.
Yeah.
Is that a title you enjoy? I mean, do you?
Well, I must
celebrate?
say, when I came home after all the hoopla and doing all the talk shows and everything, and I came back to my home on Cape Cod, and the phone rang. It was my mother, and I expected her to be all excited. She said, "It's too bad you found that ship." And I said, "Well, why that?" He said, "Well, we're so proud of our sons for getting their doctorates, and you're a great scientist discovering hydrothermal vents, but now they're only going to remember you for finding the Titanic." As they say, moms are always right.
Oh, amazing stuff there. We'll have another special report tomorrow morning from John when he'll be in Southampton to mark the 100th anniversary of Titanic's departure.
This is the Thomson graving dock where the Titanic was serviced and checked over, and this, perhaps more than anything else, gives you an impression of just how big a ship it was. It was longer than 2 football pitches and had 8 decks. It was the biggest moving object on Earth.
God, it really gives you an idea of the size there, doesn't it?
Yeah, looking forward to that report from John tomorrow.
Exactly 100 years since it set sail, a documentary claims to have found new evidence about why the Titanic sank, as Carla Eberhardt reports.
It's a mystery which has baffled experts for the last 100 years. Why did lookouts on board the Titanic fail to notice the iceberg ahead? Now historian Tim Moulton believes a mirage at sea could be the answer, after studying weather records unseen for a century. A mirage which is created when hot and cold air collide can distort the sea and raise the horizon. This would have concealed the iceberg and, in the dark of night, made it invisible. The theory is not only supported by weather records, but also eyewitness accounts.
First-class passenger Philip Mock, in his lifeboat, he describes that as Titanic sank, a column of black smoke rose high into the air and then flattened out at the top like a mushroom.
Possible proof that mirage conditions existed at the wreck site, and potentially the answer to Titanic's final mystery.
100 years ago today, the Titanic set sail on her maiden voyage to New York.
John Stapleton is live at the Ocean Dock in Southampton this morning, where a luxury liner began her fateful journey. Morning to you, John. What's the mood around the town today?
Well, I think once people arrive here, Dan, it will be a mood of sombre reflection, because nowhere was hit harder than Southampton by the sinking of the Titanic. More than 500 of the 1,500 people who died came from this area. We have a picture, actually, of the Titanic moored in this very dock at the very spot where I'm standing right now before it set off on its fateful journey. It was a picture used by the film director James Cameron to compile a computer image of the ship for his iconic movie. And of course, Titanic came here to pick up its passengers and crew, but it was conceived and it was built across the Irish Sea in the city of Belfast. The most famous, if not infamous, ship in history, Titanic. She lies now 2.5 miles down on the bottom of the Atlantic, a monument to human arrogance, incompetence and tragedy. To better understand what happened to her, I went to Belfast, to the new Titanic Belfast Experience. Here you are transported back to the Edwardian world of 1912, to the very yard where Titanic was built, along with her sister ship, Olympic. 14,000 men laboured for 2 years to build Titanic. One of them, Susie Miller's great-grandfather, Tommy.
100 years ago, this place would have been absolutely buzzing with people. There's a famous photograph of the workforce. It's like a Lowry painting. It's just all these little matchstick men, thousands of them. It was a jewel in the British Empire's crown.
Millions of people had one thought in mind in this era: emigration to America, and the great liners were built to carry them there. One-way, third-class passengers, what was called steerage.
She travelled third class on Titanic and Olympic. Her sister ship was better than first class in some of the other ships. Normally, to cross the Atlantic at that time, you had to bring a picnic with you when you're travelling third class. You had to bring all your food. Here they were dined at tables with tablecloths and they were given a menu. It was an experience.
Building these ships required enormous planning. Deirdre McIntyre's great-grandfather was Roderick Chisholm, chief draftsman.
Titanic was spectacular. She was a wonderful feat of engineering and design and craftsmanship. My understanding also is that Harland and Wolff, unlike other shipbuilding companies, they did everything. The hulls, the propellers, the fitting out, everything was done here. We didn't ship it out to somewhere else. Belfast did it all.
But early in the construction process, a critical decision was made. How many lifeboats will be on board?
We'll never need lifeboats for every passenger. They're ferries, nothing more.
On May the 31st, 1911, the great hull of Titanic was launched. A year was then spent fitting her out. Sumptuous cabins, restaurants for first and second class, more basic amenities for third, rooms and facilities for 2,400 passengers and 900 crew. This is the Thomson Graving Dock where the Titanic was serviced and checked over, and this, perhaps more than anything else, gives you an impression of just how big a ship it was. It was longer than 2 football pitches and had 8 decks, the equivalent of 11 stories. It was the biggest moving object on Earth. Once completed and fully crewed, Titanic left Belfast for Southampton to collect her waiting passengers. Once fully laden, she set off on her maiden voyage for New York. It was the 10th of April, 1912, 100 years ago today. And at midday today, we expect to see a flotilla of small craft here in this dock, which, led by a tug tender, will sail out of this dock into the River Test, just as Titanic did on this day 100 years ago. And here on the dock side, we anticipate some 700 descendants of people who lost their lives on the Titanic. They'll be here, and on hearing a recording of the Titanic's whistle, they will throw flowers into the water in commemoration of that event. And also, in about an hour's time, I'll be talking to my ITV colleague Fred Diney, who only recently discovered that he too had a relative who was lost on the Titanic. Back to you in the studio.
OK, thanks for now, John. In actual fact, I found out not that long ago that there were 2 lobs on the Titanic.
Ooh.
Yeah, William Arthur and Cordelia.
How interesting.
Yeah, yet to find out whether, you know, the sort of direct descendants or not. But yeah, it's likely there is some lineage there because they were Cornwall-based, which is where our family was originated. So
it's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, a connection in some small way.
And did they die on the ship?
Yeah. Cordelia's body was recovered. William's never so. More from John a little bit later on. Looking forward to seeing him with Fred Diney.
No, it's 100 years ago today that the Titanic set sail on that fateful maiden voyage to New York.
Well, John Stapleton is live at the Ocean Dock in Southampton this morning, where the luxury liner began that fateful journey. Morning, John. A beautiful morning it looks down there, but I'm sure a mixed mood around the town.
Yes, a day for sombre reflection, I think, Dan, because as you well know, nowhere was hit harder than Southampton by the sinking of the Titanic. More than 500 of the 1,500 people who lost their lives came from this area. So around midday today, we expect to see in this dock a flotilla of small craft, which will be led by a tug tender built around the same time as the Titanic, out of here and into the River Test, just as the Titanic went on this day 100 years ago. And here on the dockside, some 700 descendants of people who've lost their lives, who, on hearing a recording of the whistle Titanic blew, will throw into the water flowers in commemoration of a vessel that, of course, came here to pick up passengers and crew, but was built and conceived across the Irish Sea in Belfast. The most famous, if not infamous, ship in history, Titanic. She lies now 2.5 miles down on the bottom of the Atlantic, a monument to human arrogance, incompetence and tragedy. To better understand what happened to her, I went to Belfast, to the new Titanic Belfast Experience. Here you are transported back to the Edwardian world of 1912, to the very yard where Titanic was built. 14,000 men laboured for 2 years to build Titanic. One of them, Susie Miller's great-grandfather, Tommy.
100 years ago, this place would have been absolutely buzzing with people. There's a famous photograph of the workforce. It's like a Lowry painting. It's just all these little matchstick men, thousands of them. It was a jewel in the British Empire's crown.
Building these ships required enormous planning. Deirdre McIntyre's great-grandfather was Roderick Chisholm, chief draftsman.
Titanic was spectacular. She was a wonderful feat of engineering and design and craftsmanship.
But early in the construction process, a critical decision was made. How many lifeboats will be on board?
We'll never need lifeboats for every passenger. They're ferries, nothing more.
On May the 31st, 1911, the great hull of Titanic was launched. A year was then spent fitting her out. This is the Thomson graving dock where the Titanic was serviced and checked over. And this, perhaps more than anything else, gives you an impression of just how big a ship it was. It was longer than 2 football pitches and had 8 decks, the equivalent of 11 stories. It was the biggest moving object on Earth. Once completed and fully crewed, Titanic left Belfast for Southampton to collect her waiting passengers. Once fully laden, she set off on her maiden voyage for New York. It was the 10th of April, 1912, 100 years ago today. Well, joining me now on the dockside, my ITV colleague Fred Dinage, who is hosting this commemoration service today and also had a great uncle on board the Titanic when it left this very dock.
James Richard Dinage, age 47, from Fremantle in Southampton. He was a first-class steward on the Titanic, married with one rather poorly young son, and sadly he went down on it. And the extraordinary thing is, John, I didn't know this until a couple of years ago when one of the viewers of Meridian Tonight, the show I do for ITV on the South Coast, did my family tree, and there it revealed that I had a great uncle who went down on the Titanic.
And you actually not long ago met them? It must have been very nice.
2 relations I didn't know I'd got, 2 distant cousins, Lynn and Keith Bradley, also obviously related to James Richard Dinage, and I didn't know they were my distant cousins.
Now just spell out for us the devastating effect this must have had on this community 100 years ago, because it was incredible, wasn't it?
It affected hundreds and hundreds of families. Commemoration ceremony here starting at 11:15 this morning. There will be 700 relatives of people who went down on the Titanic. It's going to be an amazing thing, I think. Very sad, very touching. Music from the Royal Marines Band, the Southampton Choral Society, readings, a beautiful script from my colleague David.
And 600 kids walking through the city with placards with the names of those who were lost and images of those who were lost.
Going to the beautiful new Sea City Museum in Southampton, being opened by James Cracknell. It's going to be an extraordinary day for Southampton, which was a community, as you say, so badly affected by this awful tragedy.
Well, we wish you well. Thanks very much indeed. Good to see you again, fella.
Good to see you, John, as well.
Back to you in the studio.
Brilliant. Nicest
John,
man in television, Fred Dinage. Love him. Lots more on the Titanic this week, including a fantastic interview with the great niece of the ship's captain.
It was easy to blame it all on him, wasn't it, really? Because the bloke wasn't there to defend himself. And I mean, he was ultimately responsible.
This week marks the 100th anniversary of the ill-fated Titanic voyage. We're all talking about it at the moment, aren't we? It's such a fascinating and terrifying story.
It's enduring, isn't it? The tragedy claimed the lives of 1,517 passengers and crew. This morning, John Stapleton meets the descendants of some of those who died with the ship.
In the Belfast dock where Titanic was built, descendants of those who perished admire family mementos of the tragedy. Deirdre McIntyre's great-grandfather was Roderick Chisholm, the ship's chief draftsman. He travelled on Titanic as part of the Guarantee Group, a hand-picked team of workers. He went down with the ship.
They were obviously chosen, not just for their professionalism and their talent and their skills. They were men of integrity. What is precious to us as a family is when the ship left, when Roderick got to Southampton, he purchased 2 vases to send home to his wife, Susan. He had time to think of his family and to think of his wife. And to me, that's the story of Titanic.
Did any of the Guarantee boys survive?
No, none of them survived. Not one of them.
Susie Miller's great-grandfather was builder Tommy Miller. He was also on Titanic, and as he said goodbye, he pressed 2 pennies into his son's hands.
Don't spend them till I come back.
My grandfather was only 5. He had really strong memories of his father, and he described how, as he watched Titanic sail away, he was clutching them so tightly in his hands that the date 1912 was burnt into his palm. For me, Titanic is a personal thing. It's not about a ship, it's about a person, and it's about how it shaped my life and my family's future.
Kate Dornan's great-grandfather John was one of Titanic's surgeons. He wrote a letter to his mother on Titanic stationery and posted it before the ship sailed. It's one of many memories she treasures.
Tell us about his last night on the Titanic, what you know about that.
The last night was exciting for him because we know that he dined at the head table with people like the Astors and multimillionaires. It was a great night of great revelry and celebration, and he must have just thought he'd really arrived.
Iceberg, right ahead.
Then the blow struck. And then he went up on deck and helped passengers getting into lifeboats, and then said a last farewell.
And then there's Pat Lacey, the great niece of Titanic's captain Edward Smith, a man condemned by history for ignoring the ice warnings.
There is no obligation to go down with the ship, sir.
Isn't that for me to judge?
It was easy to blame it all on him, wasn't it, really? Of course, the bloke wasn't there to defend himself. And I mean, he was ultimately responsible. They didn't really worry that there weren't enough lifeboats. I mean, because it was unsinkable. And I mean, I think when it struck, after it struck the iceberg, people still didn't believe it was going to sink. Lessons were learnt, and I don't think they should be forgotten. You know, that there always are enough lifeboats now. No, I think it should be remembered and regretted deeply.
Amazing stories.
Yeah,
amazing
fantastic stories. Some of them.
What the people that are fascinated by the Titanic? What do you call them?
Titanaracs.
Titanic.
Yeah. And there were 2 lobs. I told you this before.
Yeah.
There were 2 lobsters actually on the Titanic.
One down the Titanic.
Yeah, that died that night. William, Arthur, and Cordelia. Now, it's the city that Titanic was never destined to reach, but 100 years since its sinking, New York City is building up for the 100-year anniversary with everything from auctions to first-class Titanic dinners.
Ross King has left LA for once. He's headed to New York for us this morning. Morning, Ross. What are you doing there?
But we're talking about Titanic, and as you guys said, the ship never ever reached here, but incredibly enough, the appetite for it is just still here. 2 big auctions in New York, and people still desperate to get their hands on a bit of Titanic history.
A deck chair like this would normally set New Yorkers back about $50, but the future owner of this item could be sitting on an investment that could be worth thousands of dollars. This deck chair was on the Titanic and was salvaged from the ill-fated ship. It's up for auction at Bonhams in New York in one of several auction sales taking place in the US to coincide with the 100th anniversary of the disaster. The auctioneers have seen massive interest from both Americans and people around the world. But why does it capture everyone's imagination?
If you look at Pearl Harbor or 9/11, these are large-scale tragedies that capture people emotionally and historically.
This auction features both old and new Titanic memorabilia, from handwritten letters from survivors to a bell featured in the 1953 Titanic movie.
My favorite part would have to be the launch ticket. I love just thinking, I mean, it's intact, so you think of that person that didn't go, so what else did they do that day instead of going to the Titanic launch? I don't know. But seeing that being the only one in the world was pretty incredible.
Across town, a much larger auction will be taking place featuring over 5,000 items salvaged from the wreck. The catch is, though, you have to buy all the items together and promise to display them to the public. The reserve auction price? $189 million.
There we are, 189 million. That's just, what, about 120 million of your great British pounds. Maybe Kate could actually pay for it, then have the exhibition and invite you round the house for the first time, Dan.
Thank you. And then we can become real friends.
I've been to Ross's house, interestingly, haven't I? He doesn't even live on the same continent. There you go.
Thanks, Ross. Everyone's friend stateside there, of course.
Exactly. Now, this Sunday, I'm sure it hasn't escaped your notice, is the 100th anniversary of the Titanic disaster.
Yes, we've heard some incredible stories this week about the people who built the ship, those who sailed on it, and the man who discovered the wreck back in 1985.
Our final story this morning features the thoughts of Harry Diamond. His grandfather, Frank, was one of those who stoked the furnaces and was given a terrible task on that ill-fated night.
At just after 11 o'clock on the night of the 14th of April, 4 days out from Southampton, Titanic's lookouts spotted trouble.
What did you see? Thank you. Iceberg, right ahead.
Hand to starboard! Hand to starboard, sir!
The ship swerved, but grazed her hull down a massive, floating mountain of ice. Travelling on board was Thomas Andrews, Titanic's chief designer. He knew immediately his ship was doomed.
We have 2 hours! 2.5 if we're lucky. She can't sink! She can't float!
The Titanic's captain, Edward Smith, ordered women and children into the lifeboats, knowing that decisions in Titanic's design and construction, taken years before, would now condemn hundreds to a dreadful death in the freezing North Atlantic. The Titanic had 20 lifeboats, more than was required by law, but not enough to carry all the passengers and crew. And because rescuers called for women and children first, many of these left half empty. Experts reckon that had more men got on board, another 500 could have been saved. Harry Diamond's grandfather Frank was a fireman on board Titanic with an unenviable task.
His first job was to be asked to go and make sure that the third-class passengers, and particularly the men of the third class, were kept down below decks, because obviously in those days it was women and children first, first class, second class, and then only the third class. A very, very difficult job and a very unpleasant job.
As the Titanic's band played the hymn, "Nearer My God to Thee," the great ship broke up. At 02:20 on the morning of the 15th of April, her stern dipped below the surface. More than 1,500 men, women and children died. Just point out, Kate, that Frank Diamond, the chap we're talking about there, had that unenviable task of saying to passengers in third class, no, you can't escape this boat. It's first and second class first, women and children first. You've got to stay here. Subsequently survived and was the helmsman on one of the lifeboats, the last lifeboat to leave the starboard side, and rescued 68 people. So he emerged an absolute hero amongst many others, we should add.
Terrible. You wonder how he could do it, but I suppose at that point everyone said, you've got to do this in order to save women and children first, and it was the protocol that maybe saved some lives.
Those were his instructions, yeah.
Well, joining us now is Pat Lacey, the great-great-niece of the Titanic's captain, Edward Smith, and actress Ruth Bradley, who features in ITV's drama Titanic. Good to see both of you. I love the fact when I said to you, gosh, it must have been fascinating reliving all of this, you confessed to me that many people say to you, how did you survive? And assumed you were on it.
Yes, you know, I'm pretty ancient, but not quite that ancient. Yes.
What did you hear then from your great-great-uncle, who was the captain? What are the stories that came down to you?
Well, I didn't really. He was just a photograph on the bedroom wall of my brother. My brother had him in his bedroom, and then my brother came home from school one day. He was a bit older than me, and said to my mother, "Was Uncle Edward, because that's what we called him, was he captain of the Titanic?" And my mother said yes. So, you know, I thought, well, you know, what's the Titanic? But, you know, that was the first. He wasn't sort of revered, you know, he was just Uncle Edward.
How did the family sort of cope with the notion that, in the view of some people anyway, he was responsible for it going down?
Well, his widow, of course, didn't think that. No. And I mean, ultimately, he is responsible. I mean, the captain is responsible. OK, Bruce Ismay was on board. He was the chairman of the White Star Line, yes. But I mean, it was Captain Smith's ultimate responsibility, and I mean, he had to go down on it. whether, you know, it could have been rescued. He just couldn't have been rescued. Not
That
in those
story,
days.
Ruth, that we just heard about, holding third-class passengers back, I mean, epitomised what was going on the Titanic. It was a perfect reflection of Edwardian society, wasn't it? First class on the top, middle class in the middle, and the lower orders down below.
Yeah.
Of which you are one in the Titanic series.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was, and also the statistics show us that, you know, a far greater amount of steerage passengers died, just for that very reason, that it was that they were stuck below, and that it was, you know, women and children first, of course, and that a lot of the men were trapped. And luckily, I hope we don't live in a society today where that would happen. But just tragically for the passengers, that was the way it was.
Yeah, terrible, isn't it? What has it been like for you to get involved in this? Obviously, you've lived this all your life, the mythology of it all and the stories passed down. But for you, has it been fascinating to steep yourself in this for the role?
Yeah, absolutely. And also my knowledge of the Titanic was, you know, I suppose much the same as anybody else's.
Pretty vague.
Quite vague. You know, this is a tragedy that I was aware of. And obviously, you know, it was very sad and tragic, but to work on it, you, I suppose, become aware of the reality that these were just people, you know, and they weren't aware that they were part of a huge moment. They were just people, and there was a great sense of the fact in filming it that there were people just going for a new life, you know, trying to start a new life, particularly my character.
That's a tragedy,
full
isn't
of
it?
joy, you know. And my character with 4 young children and a husband, a whole new life, and so many women on that ship, you know, were in that position. And then the feeling of just being a mother and wanting to save your children, and in the research, all the things that I read about, the things that people would say to each other and how much I love you there was, and talking about hearing their husband before they went down in the lifeboat. And you just kind of think it's just real people in relationships having to deal with this in the moment.
What have you made, Pat, of all this, all the events this week? We've had commemorations in Belfast and in Southampton. We've had the Titanic series on ITV, of course, documentaries. What have you made of all that?
Well, you know, you couldn't turn the telly on, could you, without, or, you know, even turn the radio on, I think, without, you know, hearing about it. So it'll be interesting to see what happens next, won't it? Will it sink, forgive the pun, into oblivion again, as it were? Or, you know, will we go on thinking about it?
It will indeed. I tell you what, a fascinating tale I discovered the other day. 14 years before the Titanic sailed, someone wrote a novel about a ship, the biggest ship in the world, crossing the Atlantic, hitting an iceberg and sinking. And you know what the ship was called in the novel?
No.
It was called the Titan.
You're joking.
How spooky is that?
Ooh,
Yeah?
that is spooky. Oh, all this on Friday the 13th. Lovely to meet you both. Thanks very much indeed. John, you've made a shiver go down my spine.
I've become a Titanorac, as they say.
Yes, you really have. He's lived and breathed it. And ITV's Titanic concludes on Sunday night at 9 o'clock here on ITV1.